In a previous video, I shared with you 5 things I wish I knew about painting in watercolour when I first started, and many of you enjoyed watching it. In this video, I will share with you another 5 things I wish I knew when I first started painting in watercolour. So, grab a coffee and let's dive right in. I wish I would have understood the different pigment properties sooner. I went from painting in acrylics to painting in watercolour. And when I first started with watercolour, I didn't know that certain pigments granulated. I didn't know that some pigments were transparent and some were opaque. I didn't know that some stained the paper and others were easier to lift. I discovered these things along the way, but had I known about them earlier, I could have made more informed choices about the pigments that I was buying and using. I could have saved myself some money and some grief. So let's have a quick look at the pigment properties and why they are important when you choose your paints. Firstly, granulation. Some pigments granulate. When you use them on wet paper, they create a grainy or textured appearance on the paper. I'm not going to go into granulating paints here because I have a whole video about it that you can watch. I'll link to it in the description. Let's just say that maybe I wouldn't have chosen a granulating pigment for delicate rose that I once painted. As I was painting it, I wondered why the colour I was using was giving it this textured look that I didn't want. Secondly, as I mentioned, some pigments are transparent and some are opaque. I didn't know this. I just went out and bought the colours that I liked and I paid no attention to that. So why is it important to know? Transparent watercolour pigments can be layered on top of each other to create rich, luminous paintings. You can glaze with them by applying thin layers of colour over previous dry layers. Most transparent pigments are ideal for mixing because they can be easily mixed with other colours without creating muddy or dull results. And they usually create darker tones than opaque pigments. Opaque pigments might muddy a paint mixture. They have their uses, but you will most likely use more transparent pigments than you do opaque pigments. Having said that, here's a tip when you're painting. Transparency and opacity is often determined by how much you dilute the paint. If you put a transparent pigment on your paper with very little water mixed into it, it will look quite opaque. This is Schmincke's French Ultramarine, which is transparent, but I've painted it on the paper at its full intensity and it can look quite opaque. And the opposite is true. If you thin an opaque pigment with lots of water, it will look transparent. This is Schmincke's Cadmium Red Deep, which is opaque, but I've thinned it with water, which helps to make it look transparent. Thirdly, some pigments have the ability to stain the paper while others are easier to lift. You might choose a staining pigment when you want to build up multiple transparent layers to create depth and luminosity in your painting. And you choose a pigment that is non-staining if you know that you'll need to do a lot of lifting to create highlights. Staining pigments are also really strong pigments, so it's best to dilute them with plenty of water before you apply them. This is Schmincke's Prussian Blue, which is a staining pigment. I've diluted it with water. And here it is with less water mixed into it. It's a very strong pigment. All of this stuff I didn't know, and knowing and understanding the different properties of the paints you were using is important. I didn't know what this stuff was and why it was useful. This is washi tape. It's a type of decorative adhesive tape that originated in Japan. It's made from traditional Japanese paper called washi. It's low tack, so it's not terribly sticky. And when you put it on your watercolour paper, it's less likely to damage the paper when you remove it than masking tape. I also buy decorator's masking tape from the hardware store and it works the same way. I use washi tape to create a white border around the outer edges of my paintings. I don't have to do this, but I think the painting presents better if you're trying to sell it unframed, and also when you photograph it to promote it on social media. Because it is low tack, it may lift if you use a hairdryer to dry your paint while you're painting. So I usually stick this to the watercolour paper and then I put some heavy duty masking tape over the top to keep it in place. Here on my duck painting, you can see the masking tape is sitting over the washi tape. You can just see the green edge of the washi tape showing. It's a bit of fussing, I know, but I have ripped and damaged watercolour paper by pulling the masking tape off too quickly. You can buy this online or in office supply stores. When I first started painting, I knew how to create soft edges, hard edges, and broken edges. But I didn't make use of lost edges, and lost edges are really useful for creating depth, mystery, and a sense of realism in your paintings. Here's a lost edge. Here's a lost edge. And here's a lost edge. To create them, I allow the adjacent colours or values to blend or bleed into one another so that there's no distinct boundary or edge. Or if there are no surrounding colours, I leave the edge off altogether, like I did on this woodpecker. I used to think that I had to indicate all those outer edges or the viewer would think that I've made a mistake. How wrong I was. On the subjects of my earlier paintings, I used to leave a hard edge around the outside of the subject. And when you do that, it tends to flatten the subject. It almost looks like you painted it on another piece of paper, cut it out, and glued it to a new piece of paper. Now when I paint, I'm more inclined to allow shapes to flow into one another. I might let my subject melt into the background colour in a few areas, or I'll make the colour I'm using be part of the background. I'll also look for edges that I can leave off altogether. As I mentioned, when I first started, I went out and bought a heap of colours and I kept adding to my paint collection. I think I had just about every single Winsor & Newton colour at one stage. I didn't use them all, but I did use a significant amount of them. And when I did a painting, I might have used 8 to 10 colours on the one painting. That's so unnecessary. And when you use too many colours on one painting, you risk overwhelming the composition and creating a chaotic or confusing visual effect. You risk creating muddy colours as well. These days, I challenge myself to use as few pigments as possible on any one painting. I do it not only for me, but also for my students. The fewer paints I'm using, the fewer they have to go out and buy, and the more they learn about mixing colours. There's so much to think about when you're painting. When you limit your palette, you've reduced the amount of colour options that you have to make. You can focus on more important things like the tonal values and the shapes that you're painting. On this painting here, I used just 2 colours and I mixed everything I needed from them. The same with this rhino, just 2 colours. Another thing to remember is to restrict your colours to one dominant temperature, either warm or cool. A warm painting can have little pockets of cool areas, and a cool painting can have little pockets of warm areas, but don't give them equal space on your painting. So that's just something to remember. So many times I got into a mess because I kept layering over dark areas of a painting. The more I fussed, the more the paint lifted, and then I had to keep layering to get the depth of tone that I wanted. So I've learned that there is nearly always some lifting even when your paper is completely dry, but the lifting is much more pronounced on dark colours. Staining colours help with this, but in my experience, they will also lift slightly. Now I know that if I need to paint a dark area, it's best to try and paint that in one layer. I try where I can to get the pigment dark enough on that first application. With this cardinal, I wanted the red to be really vibrant, but I knew if I didn't put enough pigment on it, I'd have to layer some more. And if I had to do that, I risked disturbing it and making a mess. So I tried to get the tonal value I needed in that first layer of paint. I find red a really difficult colour to work with. It never dries dark enough, and it nearly always lifts when I re-wet it and try to deepen the colour. So I knew when I painted this cow that I should get the black markings on in one layer, because I didn't want to have to repaint them and risk disturbing them. So just be aware that the darker you put the paint on the paper, the more easily it lifts when you re-wet it, which is why it's advised to paint the darkest areas of your painting last. Because once those darks go on, if you've got more work to do around or on those darks, then you're going to disturb them and you'll get in a mess. So there you are. There's 5 more things I wish I knew when I first started painting in watercolour. I hope they're useful to you. I'm still learning 12 years on, and I will continue to learn about painting in watercolour for the rest of my life. And I hope you will too. Thanks for watching. Please give the video a like, subscribe to the channel, and stay for the bloopers, because there's always bloopers. I'll see you next week.
That way a little bit more. Stop. Sit. Roll.
Good?
Yeah.
Recording? Yeah. And many of you enjoyed watching it. Are you right?
Okay,
Are we comfy?
Yeah.
We're good?
Yeah.
Okay. I didn't know if you use a hairdryer to dry your painting while you're painting. To dry your painting while you're painting. And doing that again. Really?
I heard that through these headphones.
Really? Must be lunchtime. I know. I got to do that again. Sorry. So I know when I painted. So there you are. There's 5 more things I wish I knew when I first started painting in watercolour.